How's it going everyone, Rival right here and welcome back to the channel. Don't know what it is about Pokemon and milestone years, but they seem to come thick and fast. The switch over to the, Switch has been quite an interesting time for Pokemon. The total number of sales indicate that Pokemon is still growing, but when you peel back that number and look at the percentages of games sold compared to the consoles sold, it actually doesn't look as impressive as it sounds. I do think with the exception of Let's Go Pokemon, the time on the Switch has been a little bit mixed in terms of fan reception to say the least. Granted, I don't think criticism necessarily sticks around with Pokemon. The series goes hand in hand with revisionism like Peanut Butter does with Jelly, Jordan does with Pippin, and Manchester does with Being Red. Also, I don't know why, but I can't say that word properly. Revisionism. Changing opinions. Over time, we have consistently seen a shift in opinion on each generation. Gen 4 had a lack of fire types that frustrated people. Gen 5 was a soft reset. Gen 6 was way too easy. Gen 7 was our first non-main gym challenge generation. I have mentioned these points multiple times in previous videos, so I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much. But for some reason, no matter the generation, over time fans will come to like a generation a bit more than its initial release. Is there a reason for this? Could be that Pokemon is a series that just needs to marinate for a bit with people before they're able to appreciate what a generation brings. Is it the ever-changing landscape of Pokemon fans and their age ranges? Or could it just be that every release is worse than the last, so we start to appreciate the previous generation a bit more? Truth be told, I don't know the answer. It's probably going to take a bit of a deep dive in itself into the time-adapted appreciation of Pokemon games that seems to appear every year. But anyways, on to today's video. We are 5 years on from the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield this year, which was the first main series generation title on the Switch. Sword and Shield at the time probably received the most backlash of any main series title that had been released so far, until the most recent one. Most of it boiling down to a major decision by Pokemon that essentially changed the landscape of the series forever. Was it for bad? Was it for good? Well, we'll get into that. But 5 years on, I think it's time to see if Pokemon Sword and Shield can receive the generational revisionism that so many other Pokemon games have before. And to start, let's look back at the development of the games itself. You see, Nintendo has always been one step ahead in terms of its marketing and gaming. When creating a console or a game on the PC, the main draw for people is usually the graphics. I like to refer to it as the graphical ghost hunting adventure, that in my personal opinion is one of the biggest plagues in gaming in general. That's not to say that graphics aren't important, they most certainly are, but they should not beat functionality, playability and exclusivity. Back in the days, there was more of an importance on proper exclusives within the gaming world that would have drove you to buy a particular console. Halo was only on Xbox, which was a big part of me buying that console. Now, exclusivity still exists, but not to the level that it once was, except for Nintendo. You see, they kept all their key ones to themselves. As every console is rummaging for the next graphical improvement in gaming, Nintendo's opted for a different approach, to combine their very well received handheld consoles with a home console to make a hybrid. Now, they ended up sacrificing some functionality in terms of graphical capability for adaptability instead. Now, you can criticize the graphics for not being as high as the other consoles, but one thing you can't criticize is how the Switch is now the third best selling console of all time, and is in prime position to potentially take over the two that are above it. To make this a successful adventure, not only did they sacrifice a bit of graphical capability, they also had to focus on getting their main franchises on the console as well. As such, it was important to get Pokemon on a new console as a prime money maker. Slight issue with that is that Pokemon was going to have its first adventure onto home consoles. The ones that had been done previous were not a main series title. Yeah, there was an RPG style like XD Gale of Darkness and Colosseum. We'd also already featured the battling like with Stadium and Battle Revolution, but it's going to take time to perfect it, and time was not something Nintendo had, unfortunately. So they started immediately after release of Generation 7 with Ultra Sun and Moon, and in the meantime Nintendo decided that they needed to get a Pokemon game out on the home console to test its capabilities but also drive people towards the console. And as such, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee hit the Switch before Generation 8 came out, and it was a great benefit to Nintendo. Generation 1 is, well, Generation 1. It's already been done twice, so the story and region is not something that they would have to build completely from scratch. Plus, the combination of Pokemon Go elements that made the game a bit more of a watered down version meant it was quite a low risk thing to do, but provided a higher reward because there was a Pokemon game on the new console very quickly. This work was being completed simultaneously with Pokemon Sword and Shield. Overall, after being released in November 2019, Sword and Shield was in development for around 2.5 to 3 years, though it's important to note that some of that focus was taken away for Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Now, the development of Sword and Shield brought forth the major decision and discourse that was pretty much the sticking point for most fans, and would be the cause of a lot of flack for the series that pretty much changed the entire landscape going forward. So, what is Dexit? Well, it was the decision by the developers of Pokemon to not include every Pokemon in future releases, instead just focusing on a handful, essentially meaning that for the first time you could not get every Pokemon in the current generation. Because its region is also based on the good old United Kingdom, its name naturally coincided with a political decision that was very contentious around the time that it was made, that was also very poorly reviewed by some but liked by others. Take of that one what you will. Now, the major logistical selling point of Dexit was the idea that you would get less Pokemon, but they would be used more effectively, instead of getting every Pokemon, but they'd be used poorly. On a fundamental level, this is a pretty logical reason. If time constraints exist and they feel they cannot effectively manage and use every Pokemon correctly, it would be better to use Pokemon in a more constructive and effective manner. Has it worked out that way? Well, hindsight is a bit. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's very poorly reviewed performance issues have shown that Dexit hasn't headed in the way it was supposed to. Funnily enough, the people who voted for the aforementioned political decision didn't get what they want as well, so its name fits pretty well. There's a lot of controversy surrounding Dexit. The first thing is collectors of Pokemon could no longer potentially get every Pokemon in one game. Back in the day, you could transfer everything across platforms and eventually get it into your game in some manner. This would be no longer possible, with Pokemon instead being blocked off from being transferred to new games via Pokemon Home. Pokemon has of course always had a big tie to catching them all, and this isn't very catching them all. If you could look past the collecting aspect essentially being thrown out the window, the next step is to look at the reason behind it and its benefit. As we said, if we had a focus on making some Pokemon the best possible instead of everything poorly, then at least we could use the argument they did what they were looking for and it was of top quality. Unfortunately, we're now in Generation 9 and there's performance issues still, and things aren't of the highest quality that they should be. Dexit is stuck at a bit of a crossroads, because why has Dexit been done in the first place if they haven't met their promise? One argument is definitely laziness. They just didn't want to animate and put in the effort to do every single Pokemon to the quality that they should have, so they decided to cut a lot of Pokemon to decrease the amount of work they need to do. Another potential argument is Pokemon Home. You see, while it's a free option, it also has a premium option. The premium option covers an additional cost that isn't included in the free option. One major point is transferring Pokemon from Pokemon Bank on the 3DS, which is no longer online. Bear in mind, we can't access some Pokemon currently without transferring them from Pokemon Bank at all, and we can't access all Pokemon in one game, so we have to buy multiple games to get them all. So to get every Pokemon in Pokemon Home, you will need a premium plan of Pokemon Home just to transfer a few Pokemon that aren't even available on the Switch games, unless you got them in Pokemon Go. And you can't access every Pokemon in one game, so you need multiple to access and collect them all. Now, I do believe despite the issues with performance in Pokemon games, that the idea we have for Dexit to save them time and allow them to concentrate on doing Pokemon correctly is definitely a part of it. The reality is, no matter what we think, making 1,000 Pokemon for one game rendered well, making sure everything is top shape, is an incredible amount of development time. Development time that they may not have had, because the game has to be out in a certain amount of time, either near the anniversary or at Christmas time for all the kids and adults to get it for Christmas. But there's certainly no denying that there's certain financial benefits to not having every Pokemon in one game, and I think both go hand in hand. Not every business decision is either a money hoarding tactic or a decision that benefits the franchise. Sometimes it can be both. Because of sentimental feelings towards Pokemon and being able to get every Pokemon in one game like previous, it will always be a contentious decision. But unlike its namesake, I do see the benefit in doing it, especially for the developers who are probably under a lot of pressure, considering Pokemon would make a decent ranking as a country if it had a GDP, because it earns so much money each year. Now, the region of Sword and Shield for myself is the most important one Pokemon has ever made, and the best one of course, because the map is based on the Great United Kingdom. Putting that in quotation marks. Now, there has been a bit of a debate about which Pokemon city is based on which city in the UK, so let's have a look and try and break down some of the key locations that have definitely taken inspiration. Windon, or is it Windon? Anyways, it's the epicenter of the region, which naturally means it's based on London. To further advance this, there's also famous landmarks that exist, including the stadium, which looks like it's based on Wembley, even incorporating the famous arch. This checks out considering the stadium in Pokemon serves as the host for the Champions Cup, Cup, the main competition of the league, and Wembley Stadium is considered the home of football, hosting the FA Cup final every year in the UK, and regularly being touted as one of the most important stadiums in the world. There's also a big wheel there too, which is an obvious reference to the London Eye. Motorstoke, location of the third gym, which is fire type. Now the city is very industrial, and this is the one that I'm most certain of, and I think it's based on Manchester, home to the best football team in the country, of course, 15 years ago. I'll put an image up on screen comparing them both, and I'd say it's pretty accurate. I think this is further pushed by the inspiration it takes from football in general with the jerseys, etc. As a country, we're pretty football obsessed, hence the whole "it's coming home" phrase that annoys everybody. Hammerlock is a weird one. The university for me feels like it's based on Oxford or Cambridge, arguably the two most prestigious universities in the country, but if you consider the map and its location more north, I would have thought that it was based on Edinburgh in Scotland, but I have my doubts about this one because of something else in the game. Naturally, I don't think it's necessarily properly based on location. I mean, the main stadium is high in the north, but Wembley is in London in the south, so it's not necessarily accurate. It's more based on elements that we have. Turffield takes inspiration from Stonehenge, which is a very popular landmark in the UK. Not that I've ever been. I actually think Pokemon did pretty well in capturing the essence of the UK. Some are a bit more profound and noticeable, but in general, I think they did pretty well. That being said, I have absolutely no clue what Ballia is based on. If anyone could help me figure that out, that would be great. A total of 96 Pokemon were added across all the content in Pokemon Sword and Shield, which was the most added by this point since Generation 5. Because there have been so many Pokemon introduced, they had to find new ways to innovate old Pokemon in order to bring new life to evolution lines. We'd already had the introduction of region variant Pokemon, but Generation 8 introduced the idea of region variant evolutions. This meant some Pokemon who had region variants could now evolve into a new Pokemon entirely. For me, the one that leads the line is definitely Obstagoon, a great modification of the Zigzagoon line that provided it with a bit more usefulness than being a HM Pokemon or pickup merchant. Others included a Mr. Rhyme evolution called Mr. Rhyme, which sounds like it's about to drop a massive diss track on us at some point. Cursula for Corsola, a new alternate evolution for Meowth. They gave Farfetch something they should have given it 6 generations ago, and a Yamask evolution with one of the weirdest methods I've ever seen. And we've been here for a while evolving things by turning DSs upside down. If you want what my favourite Regent variation was, I think Weezing getting a hat or Slowbro getting a shell arm were up there for me. I quite like the Regent bird that was introduced this generation. In fact, it's up there as one of my favourites in general, and we have a Pokemon now based on tea, because us British people solve all our issues by putting the kettle on. A fun introduction alongside the Pokemon was a new area in which we could access them in the wild area. The wild area seems to be based on the Lake District in the UK, which is a popular national park, and it's a big area that connects multiple cities in the region. To stop you travelling from just one city to another with no issues, they stuck strong Pokemon in later areas, so you couldn't simply just skip them. This method of the wild area allows us to incorporate the new idea that I like to classify as the generational gimmick. For Generation 8, it was Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing. Now, I have had this debate previously on my channel, and it is true that Generation 7 does have Mega Evolution, but since Generation 6, Pokemon has introduced a new idea, or what I call a gimmick, that usually features just exclusively in that region as a new method of playing. This is an idea by Pokemon Team to provide something new and innovative to each region, so they feel different in core gameplay. Some are not as well received as others, of course. I think most would agree Mega Evolution is probably the best one that's been done, but they exist as a method to try and provide Pokemon with a different way of playing. We're at the stage now where by the 8th generation for these games, if you don't have something different, then it's just the same style of gameplay with no change. We've already had the big changes previously in terms of gameplay, such as new types, balancing acts for moves, special and physical splits, so on and so forth. In terms of the core gameplay, there's not too much you can change, so instead it's important that Pokemon provides you with something different each generation, otherwise what's going to stop you from saying it's just the same as previous? Now, Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing is a temporary transformation within the game that increases the power and size of a Pokemon and allows them to use new moves that are stronger. It is a core part of the gameplay and the story as we try to understand why it happens. Where does it rank in terms of the generational gimmicks? I'd definitely say around the middle of the pack. I don't think it's the worst one, but it's certainly not the best either. The best one is pretty obvious because it's the only one that has returned in some capacity in other generational games. Now, another big change in Pokemon was the introduction of DLC. For years and years, we've always expected a third game or 2 games in the case of Black and White White 2 and Ultra Sun and Moon. The only time we've not received this is X and Y, but that's a whole explanation in itself. Why have we removed the third games? Well, it's an interesting one really. More often than not, a third game has the same basis as the first two, but will have story modifications or new content, like how Emerald and Platinum modified the story a little and added the Battle Frontier. The exception to this rule is Black and White 2, because they are sequels and did significant modifications to the game, including multiple new gym leaders and new locations. A DLC does allow a new area to be added to the games with their own story or idea, instead of modifying the story slightly. We got 2 for Sword and Shield, the Isle of Armor, which seems to be based on the Isle of Man, and the Crown Tundra, which seems to be based on Edinburgh, even more so than Hammerlock. This DLC allows for the addition of new Pokemon, as well as adding back Pokemon that have previously been axed off by Dexit. We got Regent variants for legendaries for the first time in Articuno, Zapdos and Moltres, while also getting new Regis to the game. Is moving to DLC the right move for Pokemon? Well, in general, games moved to DLC anyways years ago, and now Pokemon is on the home console, so it does make sense that they've moved. But I actually think it depends on what you want. DLC adds content exclusively to games, so if you want to see new content without getting to go through the same region again, then DLC is the way forward for you. On the other hand, third games are better for fixes. If you think of the issues that exist in Scarlet and Violet, for example, added DLC does not solve the issues that the region had. Third games can allow for things such as new UI, like how the battles are displayed in Diamond and Pearl compared to Platinum, as well as just general fixes. Sure, updates could fix the problems, but a reset is usually better, especially considering the current state of Pokemon, and specifically the frustrations that currently exist with the franchise. I think both are good. One gives a better opportunity for fixes, the other is better for just adding content, so take your pick. Now, the question is, has Pokemon Sword and Shield passed the frustration stage, and can we appreciate it a bit more? Well, I personally think that Sword and Shield's main frustrations boil down to 2 core elements. The first was obviously the backlash for Dexit. The decision to not include every Pokemon in one game was a pretty big change. We've already mentioned the potential reasons why it happened, and objectively you might be able to understand, but that doesn't change the fact that the decision was a pretty big one that frustrated the fanbase. There's a pretty big importance on catching them all for some people, and being the first one where it literally was impossible to do so was naturally going to get some backlash. The second was it was the current one out at the time. Every generation when it comes out features backlash and frustration for everybody because it's the most recent one. That's part of having a fanbase that's both getting older and also younger at the same time, as well as having a lot to compare it to. I mentioned this in my video detailing Gold and Silver 25 years on, but Generation 2 is in a good position because it was the first ones to follow. All they had to do was improve and be better than the first one, and they were. They solved issues in the gameplay, had 2 regions, improved Pokemon lost in Generation 1, and was a massive step in the right direction. Since then, every generation has more to compare it to. Gen 3 is great, but it doesn't have 2 regions, and apparently too much water. Gen 4 is great, but it's slow. Where are the fire types? Gen 5, where are the old Pokemon? We can keep going, but Generation 8, there's a lot to compare it to nowadays. And because Pokemon has so many fans of so many ages, everybody has a favourite from previous, so they will always compare it to that. I'm always going to hold Generations 1 to 5 in the highest esteem because they were my favourite generations. But that doesn't mean that any new ones can't be good. I think most importantly, there needs to be a separation of nostalgia and current state of play. Every new Pokemon game gets the scrutiny, and adding the big decision that's always going to be met with frustration, you are going to be review bombed in the end. And I'm going to openly say in the past I've been guilty of this myself. X and Y especially, I gave a lot of criticism for being too easy when it came out. This isn't an isolated occurrence, and most of us have been guilty of this. It's only human nature at the end of the day. There's both negatives and positives about Sword and Shield. If you want the biggest negative, I wouldn't say that it's Dexit. I'd actually say that to feel complete, you have to have the DLC. And this is an unfortunate byproduct of having DLC instead of having a third game. With it included though, I definitely say they're very complete games. There's a lot of content there, new region variants, the wild area as well. And I think upon release, we always look at the negative first. But I've never truly thought that there's a bad main series Pokemon game. There's certainly weaker ones, and there's some with bigger flaws than others, but the core of the franchise is always there. I do think 5 years on, it's time to lighten up to Sword and Shield, because they were nowhere near as bad as the initial reaction. But hey, what do I know? Thanks for watching, guys. So, throwing it over to my comments. What's your opinion on Pokemon Sword and Shield? Are they good games? Do you hate them? I'd love to hear. Make sure to like and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and follow me on Twitter for some more Pokemon opinions. I refuse to use this other name. Bye, guys.